You know that mitzvahs fall into categories. There are certain mitzvahs that are called mishpatim. Mishpatim means rational statutes. The laws of theft, the laws that prescribe killing, make sense. Doesn't require any elaborate explanation. Everyone understands intuitively why these things should not be done. There are other mitzvahs that are called chukim. The chukim are mitzvahs which, at first glance, do not make sense. We don't understand why they should be performed, what the underlying rationale is. Chok means it's a decree of the king, we can't question. And there are many mitzvahs in the Torah. We can offer conjectures, but we can't really know with a certainty what underlies the mitzvah, the prohibition of meat and milk, for example. There's one mitzvah in the Torah which is the quintessential chok. It's the mitzvah which is an absolute mystery, and that's the mitzvah which our parsha begins with, which is the mitzvah of the Parah Adumah. The Parah Adumah is the red cow. What is this mitzvah? We know that if a person comes in contact with a dead body, he becomes impure, becomes tamei. Normally, a person who is tamei deals with this by immersing in a mikveh, and that is the only act of purification which is required. However, in the case of a person who came in contact with a dead body, immersion is not enough. He also requires hazah. Hazah means that he be sprinkled with water to which ashes of the Parah Adumah have been added. So our parsha begins with a description of how the ritual of the Parah Adumah is performed. This cow is taken, slaughtered, it's burnt, reduced to ash. The ashes are mixed with mayim chayim, with spring water, and those waters, which have been sanctified with the ashes of the Parah Adumah, now can be sprinkled upon the people who have come in contact with the dead, and this affects purification. The Torah goes on to talk about the very detailed laws as to how the impurity of a dead body is transmitted, either by touching or by moving it, or by being in the same room with it. And all these halachas are very technical, very complex, and their underlying rationale is very, very elusive. We don't really understand exactly what the purpose of Parah Adumah is. There is one specific aspect of Parah Adumah which is even more mystifying. That on the one hand, the Parah Adumah is meant to purify. You sprinkle on the people who came in contact with the dead, and this affects purification. And yet, on the other hand, people who handle the ashes of the Parah Adumah unnecessarily become impure. So the same ashes have the power to purify and the power to defile. And that seems to be a paradox. How can the same thing have opposite characteristics? On the one hand, it purifies the people who came in contact with the dead. On the other hand, it defiles the people who came in contact with it unnecessarily. It's mitaher es hatmeim, it purifies the impure, and it's mitamei es hatahirim, and it defiles the people that are pure. So what substance can have two opposite qualities? So it's not just that this is a chok in the sense we don't understand it. It seems to be a paradox. It seems to be something which is an internal contradiction. If not for that paradox, we could live with things we don't understand. No one understands everything. There's a lot to know. No one knows everything. How do they put the toothpaste in the tube? No one knows. It's a mystery. Okay, you live with it. You can deal with it. A paradox is a different problem. The paradox is not just we don't understand, but there's an internal contradiction. X and Y both cannot be true. So it's not just something that I lack understanding of, it's something which is much more painful. And Parah Adumah is not just a chok in the sense that we don't understand what the purpose, why should we burn this red cow, etc. It's that there's an internal contradiction within the laws of the Parah Adumah, that the ashes of the Parah Adumah have opposite and contradictory qualities that they defile and purify at the same time. And how can that be? There's a very interesting thing that Chazal tell us about the Parah Adumah. That the Parah Adumah is an atonement for the sin of the golden calf. When the Jews traveled in the desert, so Moshe went up to receive the Torah in Har Sinai. The Jews thought he was dead, so they wanted a replacement. So they commissioned the manufacture of a golden calf, which would be God's mouthpiece. There were certain individuals who misunderstood the idea of the golden calf, and they thought that it was meant to be an object of worship. And they began to bow to it, to offer sacrifices to it. Other Jews didn't stop them, so they also were implicated in the crime. This was the terrible sin of the Egel Hazov, the golden calf. And God really felt that the Jewish people as a whole were deserving of destruction. In other words, the Egel worshippers certainly were deserving of destruction. The rest of the Jews did not do enough to stop them, so they also were implicated. So really, the nation should have been destroyed. Moshe Rabbeinu prayed in their behalf. He was able to arouse the Midas Harachamim, the attribute of God's mercy, and the punishment was suspended. But an atonement is still required. If the Jews weren't cleansed of their sin, they were pardoned. The punishment was delayed. But the sin is still in place. There's a need for cleansing, for atonement. And that atonement is affected by the Parah Adumah. And that's why the ritual is performed with a parah, which of course is the mother of the egel, of the calf, to show that in the same way that a mother takes responsibility for a child, so somehow the parah takes responsibility for the egel hazov. How do we understand that? What really is the atonement? What is achieved with the ritual of the Parah Adumah that somehow cleanses us of the sin of the egel hazov? I think the answer to this question is because the temptation to worship Avodah Zarah is also because when we think about God, there is a seeming paradox, which our inability to cope with virtually drives us to idolatry. What is this seeming paradox? On the one hand, when we think of God as being lofty, as being infinite in His power, in His wisdom, in His virtue. He is beyond grasp, beyond conception. A human being can't have an inkling of what God is, and therefore it makes no sense that God should be concerned with us and what we do. Because why is it and how is it that what we do on this earth makes any difference, is of any interest to Him? He is so great and we are so low, so it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense. Why should it be that God cares about what we do? Why should God be involved in micromanaging our lives? It just doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense. This problem, the inability to fathom God's infinite greatness and at the same time His interest in our petty, small, insignificant lives, the Rambam tells us really was the problem that drove people to the worship of idols. And the Rambam, in the laws of Avodah Zarah, discusses this question: how did idolatry begin? Now, it's important to understand the question the Rambam is dealing with. You see, if you speak to a professor of religion, he will tell you that monotheism is a later development. Whereas originally, how did religion start? One description goes like this, that people buried their dead, and they went to the cemeteries, and they imagined hearing the voices of their departed loved ones, and they imagined that their departed loved ones had become spirits who were now communicating to them from the other world, and this in turn developed into a belief in spirits and gods, and ultimately this was refined until religion became monotheistic. In other words, a description of the development of religion, which is based on an evolutionary process, which is the paradigm which social scientists always apply to the explanation of any phenomenon. There's always a forward march, a ongoing development from the low to the sublime. But the truth is that historically that isn't the case, at least as the Torah puts it. Adam Harishon and Chava, the first human beings, were certainly monotheists. They spoke to God, they had a relationship with God, and therefore, in our view, it's the opposite. Human beings started as monotheists, and later the religion became corrupted, and people became polytheistic. So the question is, how did it happen? Well, it's not that human beings began as polytheists, and then religion became refined until it reached a monotheistic ideal. It was the opposite. People started as monotheists, and so now the religion became corrupted, and they became pagans. So what happened? What happened? What went wrong? So the Rambam says it was exactly this that went wrong. People said, how is it possible? God is so high. God is so lofty. How is it possible He cares, He's concerned with our mundane affairs? It can't be. And therefore they said, it must be that God is the head of a tremendous bureaucracy. And there are layers and layers and layers and layers of underlings, and our contact is really not with God as CEO. We really relate only to some being which is much farther down the totem pole, and therefore our worship and our service should be directed to that being. And that is how idolatry got off the ground. That's how paganism got off the ground. Because of the inability to cope with this paradox. How is it possible that God is infinitely great, and yet at the same time He is interested and concerned with our mundane affairs? Now, if you think that this issue is not an issue, you have to understand that perhaps the most dominant religion in the world, which is Christianity, though maybe Islam is swiftly catching up, Christianity is actually rooted in the same paradox. The idea of the Trinity, of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, which really means the Father, which is God as creator, the Son, God who reveals Himself through the personality of Jesus, and the Holy Spirit, which is the godliness within every human being. That doctrine of the Trinity really is an attempt to answer this question. In other words, if God is infinitely great, how do we have a relationship with Him? And the answer is that there is an aspect of God which we can't relate to. That's called the Father. But there are two other aspects in the Godhead, so to speak, to which we can relate. The Son, who reveals Himself, again in the personality of Jesus, and the Holy Spirit, which is within each and every one of us. This is the question that Christianity was coming to address. this apparent paradox. And it addressed it by setting up what, from our perspective, is a polytheistic system. In other words, you divide the Godhead into segments, and therefore you say that there's one aspect which is infinite and unapproachable, and there are other aspects that are closer to us and are therefore approachable. And that's how you solve the problem. So Christianity is not an ancient religion. I mean, it is ancient in the sense that it began quite a long time ago, but it's a religion which is practiced widely today, and its very basic doctrines are for the purpose of addressing this question. So as Jews, we have a very, very serious problem how to cope with this. And I have to tell you that we've also fallen into some odd things. There are Jews who, I believe, have fallen into the worship of Rebbes. They worship human beings. Because, again, they find it difficult to relate to a God who is infinite and intangible and beyond our grasp, but to relate to a human being as an exemplar of godliness, that's somewhat easier. But without going into detail, I think it can be said that many people have stepped over the line into activities that border on the heretical. So this is a very serious problem, but it's not just a problem, it's a paradox. In other words, we are called upon to juggle two thoughts which are irreconcilable. God's infinite greatness and God's interest and concern, his being immanent and near to us. This question.
Would you suggest that the Baal Shem Tov would fall into that category, or as being sort of like
Not the Baal Shem Tov fell into that category.
No, but
I suspect that it's possible that some of his followers may have fallen into that category. Not his real followers, but some of the pseudo-followers, right, may have fallen into that category.
That's what I suspect.
Now, the issue we have to deal with is that we have to know that many of the paradoxes that trouble us are really problems of language. They are semantic problems. Now, let me give you a example. You know, physicists have classified phenomena, and they've said that there are certain phenomena that can be described as particle functions, and there are certain phenomena that can be described as wave functions. And when they began to study light, they saw that light is problematic, because in some ways light functions as a particle, and in some ways light functions as a wave. So this is paradoxical. Is it really paradoxical? No, light is what it is. The problem is it resists classification within the categories that we've created. In other words, we've created two categories. You have, in box A, you have particles, and in box B, you have waves. And the question is, into which box am I going to put light? The answer is, light is what it is. But we have a problem dealing with that, because once we've invented our categories, we expect that everything should fit neatly into one or the other. If it doesn't fit here, it doesn't fit there, then we can't cope with it. But our inability to cope with it is only because of the categorization that we've established. Let me cite for you a very famous Rambam. And we'll understand, I think, the Rambam very, very well in light of the above discussion. The Rambam deals with one of the famous paradoxes, which is the problem of free will and God's foreknowledge. Well, this is a topic that has been discussed in college dormitories, perhaps for centuries, if they had them centuries ago. That on the one hand, we believe that God knows the future. Everything that will happen until the end of time, God knows already in advance what is going to happen, what will be done. Yet on the other hand, we all believe that human beings have free will. So the problem is, how is it possible that God knows now what I'm going to do tomorrow, and yet tomorrow I have the choice of doing one or the other? It's an apparent paradox. In other words, if God knows, it must already be determined. If it's already determined, in what sense can it be said I have free will tomorrow? Very, very serious problem. So the Rambam writes the following. The Rambam writes that the answer to this question requires so many introductions that the full answer is broader than the universe. But he says, I'll give you the answer in a nutshell. And the answer he gives in a nutshell is that God's knowledge is not like human knowledge. Because human knowledge comes from the observation of things outside of ourselves. Because I know things about the world. How do I know these things? Because I observe the world. So I come to know these things. God's knowledge does not come from outside of him. God's knowledge comes from within him, because God is the source of all things. So God's understanding of himself gives him an understanding of all things. And we can't understand this, because it's not part of our experience, because human knowledge always is based on the observation of things outside of us. Divine knowledge is different. And says the Rambam, because divine knowledge is different and we can't understand it, so we can't ask the question how it can be reconciled with free will. But we have to accept it as a matter of faith that God's knowledge does not preclude the possibility of free will. So did he answer the question? Not exactly. So the Ravid, who is the great critic of the Rambam, says that the Rambam did not act in the manner of wise men here. Because a wise man writing a book only raises a question if he's going to be able to give an answer. The Rambam here raised the question and then tells us we should rely on faith. So that's not the way of wise people. So what was the Rambam trying to do? What the Rambam was trying to do is reduce this question from the level of a paradox to an unanswered question. In other words, he was telling us like this, that simply to ask, gee whiz, how does God know the future? Okay? We can live without knowing the answer to that question. And we don't know how God created the world, so this is not any less of a mystery, how God knows the future. If it simply was that, how does he do it? Okay, we don't have to know how he does everything that he does. That's not our problem. The problem is there's a paradox, because there's a contradiction. God's foreknowledge is a contradiction to our free will. Says the Rambam, you can only pose a paradox if you understand the two terms. If you're going to say that X and Y contradict one another, that can only be called a paradox if you can define X precisely and define Y precisely. But if you can't define them precisely, or you can't define one of the two precisely, you can't assume there's a paradox here. The paradox only begins when I define the terms precisely. But if I admit that one of the two terms I can't define, then who says there's a paradox? So the Rambam says, once I establish clearly that we cannot understand the nature of God's foreknowledge, so therefore we can't pose this as a paradox. A paradox means where I precisely define the two terms and they are irreconcilable. But here I can't define one of the two terms at all. And therefore, I don't have the problem of living with a paradox. This much the Rambam tells us, that paradoxes are not so much a problem of real contradictions as a problem of contradictions in our definitions. Because when we define things in a certain way, then X and Y become contradictory. But the problem only begins after we provide the definitions. If I'm willing to give up one of my definitions, the paradox actually dissolves. Yes?
So how do we know that the tuma, that the ashes repair, is the same tuma that they put on to the person who's preparing the ashes?
It probably isn't. Okay, we're going to get to this in a second. You know, there's a famous philosophical question. We believe God is all-powerful. God can do everything. Can God do something which is a contradiction in terms? Can God make a square triangle? The answer is God can do anything. The problem is, but he cannot make a square triangle, because if he would make a certain thing, we would never agree that it is both square and a triangle. Because our categories don't allow for something to be both. So there's no limit to what God can do. But the way we use words, there is nothing that we will admit is a square and a triangle at the same time. That's not a limitation to God. That's really a limitation which emerges from the way in which we use words. Because if I use the word square in a certain way and the word triangle in a certain way, there's nothing that can be both a square and a triangle at the same time. But that's not a statement about the real world as much as it is a statement about how I choose to use words. And that's true. There may be, I may choose to use the words in a way that they are mutually exclusive. That's not a limitation on God. Now, there's a very fascinating Gemara. The Gemara says that the Holy of Holies in the base of Mikdash, or in the Mishkan I should say, was 10 amos square. 10 amos by 10 amos. The Aron, the Ark, which was in the base of Mikdash, was 2.5 amos long, and an arm and a half wide, and an arm and a half tall. So you put it in the Kodesh HaKadoshim, in the Holy of Holies. So you would think, well, if it's 2.5 amos, and let's say it was just in the center, so you're left with 7.5 amos, 3 1/4 or 3 3/4 on each side. So you have 3 3/4 on the left, 3 3/4 on the right. You get 7.5. It itself is 2.5. That accounts for the entire width of 10. Yet the Gemara says if you'd measure from the Aron to either of the side walls, you would measure exactly 5 amos. That Makom Aron Einam in Amida. The Aron appeared not to take up space. So if you measure from the Aron to the right wall, you get 5. You measure from the Aron to the left wall, you get 5. The entire width of the whole room was 10. So the Aron apparently takes up no space. If you'd measure the Aron itself, what would it be? 2.5 wide. How can that be? Now, is the Aron a space-occupying object or not? Well, it depends. If you measure the Aron, it seems to be 2.5 amos wide. If you measure the space in either side of the Aron, it seems that the Aron takes up no space. So, is it a space-occupying object? We have a contradiction. It's only a contradiction because we've made up two categories. There are space-occupying objects, and there are non-space-occupying objects. And we don't know in which category to put the or in. But God isn't bound by our categories. So God can make a thing which has characteristics which to us are irreconcilably contradictory, but that's what it is. If you measure it from this perspective, it's this way. If you measure it from that perspective, it's this way. And by the way, physicists have discovered all sorts of things like this in quantum physics. Now, I just want to tell you something. Whenever a rabbi mentions quantum physics, one thing you should know, he doesn't know what he's talking about. Right? Just in all honesty, it sounds good, but the truth is that I can't even begin to understand it. I don't have the mathematical background to delve into it as it should be delved into. But my understanding is, from popular reading, that quantum physics is filled with such contradictions. And these have led to philosophical discussions. But the idea is that the contradictions are because things don't fit squarely into the categories that we've created. But God isn't limited by our categories. Right? God creates a thing and invests it with the qualities He wants to invest it with. And if it doesn't fit squarely into our categories, that's really our problem. It's not His problem. The Parah Adumah is a training in living with paradox. That's what the mitzvah of Parah Adumah is designed to do. It's designed to train us to live with paradox. In other words, we perform a ritual, we deal with the ashes in such a way that it does opposite things. On the one hand, it purifies, on the other hand, it defiles. And day in, day out, we live with it, we deal with it, we work with it. And this teaches us a very important lesson, that we can live with paradoxes. It's true that the Parah Adumah doesn't fit into our categories, because in our categories, there are certain things that impart purity, and there are certain things that impart impurity. So where do you put the Parah Adumah? It doesn't fit in either category. But we have to learn to live with paradoxes. Right? God invests things with characteristics. And by the way, Tumah and Tara is not a game. It's not a game. See, if it was just a game, sometimes it does this and it does that, we can live with that too. No problem. It's a reality, Tumah and Tara. We don't have the spiritual antenna to smell it. But there are people that do. I'll tell you a story, just a very, very beautiful story. Not really a story, an interpretation. The Gemara says, it's really a dispute in the Gemara, but there's an opinion in the Gemara that says, Asida Torah shetistakach miYisrael. The time will come that Torah will be forgotten from the Jewish people. What's going to happen? So the Gemara says that a woman will go, she will bring a loaf of bread into the study hall, and she will say that the loaf of bread became defiled under such and such circumstances. And my question is, what level of impurity does it have? Because Tumah is transmitted in stages. An original source of Tumah is called an Av HaTumah, father of impurity. When it defiles something else, that becomes a Rishain, once removed. A Rishon makes something else into a Sheni, which is twice removed. Certain things become a Shlishi, 3 times removed. A Revi, 4 times removed. So a woman is going to come into the Beis Medrash, into the study hall, and ask, is this loaf of bread a Shlishi or a Revi? She'll describe the circumstances, and is it 3 steps removed or 4 steps removed? And no one will be able to answer. So that's the example of Torah being forgotten in Israel. So the Baal Shem Tov asked the question, that why does it say the woman brought the loaf of bread to the Beis Medrash. She didn't have to bring the loaf with her. She could have come and just described what happened, and they would give her an answer. Well, why did she have to come with the loaf? So the Baal Shem Tov said an amazing thing. He said, of course, if she would describe what happened, of course they would be able to tell her. That won't be forgotten. I mean, if you say what happened, that won't be forgotten. But once upon a time, there were people, they could look at the loaf, they could smell it, they could look at it, touch it, and they can tell you, this is a shlishi. This is 3 steps removed from the original source of impurity. But this is 4 steps removed. In other words, it was something, there was a reality that they could sense. That will be forgotten. But if you tell the rabbi what happened, of course they'll be able to answer the question. That won't be forgotten. That's how anybody can do that. You know, Tuma and Tara is a spiritual reality. I'll tell you an amazing story. An amazing story. Someone once went, and this is in this century, I'm not talking about something which is years ago. There was a great Talmud Chacham, this is Alman Meltzer, passed away in the 1950s. I guess not the last century, 20th century. And someone was coming to him and said, you know, when you buy a new vessel, you have to take it to the mikveh. You have to immerse it in the mikveh. It's mitzvah tfilas kelim. So if someone told Bishop Zalman that there's a certain Rebbe, he can look at the vessel and he can tell you whether it was immersed in the mikveh or not. So Bishop Zalman said, that's no trick, I can do that. So, couldn't believe it. Bishop Zalman was not a Hasidic Rebbe. He was a Lithuanian Rosh Yeshiva who didn't perform miracles routinely. So you could do that. It was very simple. Very simple. So as you look at the vessel, and you try to visualize God's name on the vessel. If you can see the letters of God's name clearly, then you know it already was immersed in the mikveh. If you cannot visualize the letters clearly, then you know that it wasn't immersed yet. Just telling you the story. In other words, these aspects of purity and impurity, this is not a game, it's not a joke. There's a reality. It's just we don't have the senses, we don't have the antenna to pick it up. The people of great spiritual sensitivity were able to look at something and they could see the spirit of impurity or the spirit of purity on the thing. And therefore that a thing should be at the same time pure and impure, having the power to impart impurity and to impart purity, that's something which doesn't fit into our categories. But that's not a problem for God. God can do whatever He wants. He can invest a thing with contradictory qualities, just like light, right? Which by our categories makes no sense. Is it a particle? Is it a wave? It is what it is. And God gave it the qualities that it has. So likewise, the ashes of the Parah Adumah have the qualities that they have. And we have to learn how to live with paradoxes. Once we learn to live with paradoxes, we are no longer tempted to fall into the trap of Avodah Zarah. Because as we said, that what is the temptation for idolatry? What is the temptation to worship tangible objects? Again, it's that same paradox we can't live with. Then how do we reconcile God's infinite greatness and at the same time believe that God is concerned with our mundane lives? That's also a paradox we can't handle. So therefore we begin to worship subordinate beings, created beings, or like the Christians, we create divisions in the Godhead. So there's one aspect which is infinite, there's one aspect which is immanent, and so on and so forth. He says we have to live with a paradox. Parah Adumah trains us how to live with a paradox. So when we get accustomed to the idea of living with contradictions, then there's another contradiction we can live with. Right? That God is both transcendent and immanent at the same time, and we can live with that. It doesn't disturb us. In the Hallel, we say a verse, a very interesting verse. It says, Ram al kol goyim Hashem. God is high above all the nations. Al Hashemayim kvodo. His glory is above the heavens. Mi kashem Elokeinu. Who is like Hashem, our God? Hamagbi l'shaves, who sits upon high. Hamashpili liros b'shamayim u'va'aretz, but lowers himself to see what goes on in heaven and earth. So the Mefarshim explain like this, that these two verses are really contrasting the way the nations of the world look at God and the way we look at God. The nations of the world, they can't handle the idea of God being both. So they say, Rama Pagayim Hashem. God is lofty above all the nations. Allah Shemayim Kvodo. His glory is above heaven. And that's it. That's where they stop. He's there. He's all the way up there. Far, far away from us. But we say, who is like the Ribono Shel Olam? Mika Hashem Elokeinu, who is like our God? Hamagbi l'shavas, he's so high. But at the same time, Hamashpili liros, he lowers himself to see b'shamayim v'aretz, to concern himself with what's below. That paradox is the paradox which allows us to worship God without intermediaries, without idols, without tangible objects, without getchkas, as they say in Yiddish. Right? We can worship the pure God because we're able to deal with that paradox of God's transcendence and God's immanence at the same time. So that's how the Parah Adumah rectifies the sin of the golden calf. In other words, it trains us how to live with paradox so that now we are not tempted to fall into the trap of idolatry. And it's an amazing thing. I don't know if you ever had a conversation with a Jewish Christian. You ever have a conversation with a Jewish Christian? Like Jews for Jesus, Messianic Jews, ever? And you'll discover this is exactly what attracts them to Christianity. What attracts them to Christianity is that you have the ability to relate to a God who is come in human form, to whom we can be close, to whom we can feel a direct connection. We don't have to relate to a God which is an abstraction, something which is beyond our grasp, beyond our conception. It's exactly this. It's exactly this. This point is don't minimize it. Don't think it's just a philosophical point. It's something which disturbs people to no end. People who, in a sense, are spiritually seeking. Can't understand how you can relate to God if you see Him as having no bodily form, being so lofty, so infinite, so great, so far removed from human experience. How do you have a relationship with Him? So that paradox is the paradox that we cope with because we are trained by the observance of Parah Adumah to live with paradox. Don't expect that God must conform to the categories that we establish for ourselves. As we establish categories, and therefore now we have things that don't fit. But the Ribono Shel Olam is not part of our categories. Now, our categories pose semantic problems, because once we set up the categories, so we don't know what word to apply to a thing which seems to fit in either category. But the Ribono Shel Olam invests the thing with the qualities that it has, and the Ribono Shel Olam himself is what he is, even if we can't understand how the various aspects can be reconciled. But I'll mention, just as an aside, just to make it a little easier to understand, that when you think about it deeply, you see that this paradox, the paradox of God's transcendence and His immanence, is not really a contradiction at all. You see, the problem of someone who is very, very, very great, dealing with issues and people that are very, very, very trivial, is really only a problem for human beings who are finite. Because if you are finite in your capacity, you're finite in terms of the time you have, in terms of the strength you have, in terms of your attention span, so you have to prioritize. You can't get bogged down in details. Imagine you're a doctor. You have a very busy practice. right? And patients are coming, and they all have a lot of questions. And they all want to ask their questions, and they want to be sure that they receive satisfactory answers. But it reaches a point. You say, lady, waiting room full of patients. I have to, end our conversation here and call the next patient in. And sometimes the doctor is only human, doesn't have the patience, to hear the same question for the 50th time that I thought I answered a half hour ago. The Ribono Shel Olam, because he is infinite, has all the time in the world for everybody. He can devote an infinite amount of attention and an infinite amount of time to an infinite number of people. It's not a contradiction. Whereas prioritization is only a problem for people who are finite, who have limits. Because God is unlimited, he can give you, in a sense, 100% of his attention 100% of the time, and that doesn't detract from his ability to devote 100% of his attention 100% of the time to everything else in the universe that ever was and ever will be. It might be hard for us to understand, but it's not a paradox anymore. It's only a good question. Gee, how can that be? But a paradox it isn't. So that's why Parshas Chukat is a very, very, very important parsha, right? We really have to learn to think as Jews who buy into the idea of Chok, that we are in God's world, not in our world. Not everything has to make sense by our standards, in our categories. And if we can master that lesson, then we will probably find it a lot easier to deal with all the questions and the apparent contradictions that life sends our way. Okay, well, yes, question.
The Pirkei Avos that says, be as careful with a big mitzvah as with a small mitzvah. And then it says, because you don't know the reward of a mitzvah. Is that a little bit paternalizing? Because really, we're not able to deal with the sort of the small and the big properly in our own minds. So we're given sort of this answer. Like, so it has the same feeling as this discussion has.
No, this Mishnah really has very simple interpretations. You see, when we talk about mitzvahs, right, there are mitzvahs kalas and mitzvahs chamuras. Right? So what makes a mitzvah kal? What makes a mitzvah chamur? So often we would think that, for example, there are certain mitzvahs which are kal because they're easy to do. And on the other hand, there are mitzvahs that are chamur because they're difficult to do. So we imagine that God must give more reward for them. On the other hand, it may be the opposite consideration. Maybe the mitzvah which is easy to do is, in a sense, more important because it's more expected of you. The mitzvah which is hard to do, God is more willing to forgive your failure to do it. So there are contradictory considerations. So when we say when you prioritize mitzvahs, again, as a person who's limited, don't necessarily say mitzvah A has precedence over mitzvah B, because there could be counter considerations that would argue on behalf of mitzvah B over mitzvah A. That's the meaning of that mission. Yes?
It's the living with contradictions, just to pick up something about the Christian concept. I mean, you've said before that it's a contradiction in terms that God could be, who's infinite, could become finite within a human being as a Christian concept. But couldn't the Christian argue back and say, that's just a paradox that we don't understand? How can that be? Well, we don't understand, but that's a paradox. That God is infinite, but he can become somehow finite in a human being, and it's not, we don't understand, it's a paradox.
It certainly is a paradox, but the point is this: that since the alternative, right, makes more sense, why should we assume the unfathomable paradox? Right? In other words, the truth is this, that sometimes we're compelled, to accept the paradox. But if we're not compelled to accept it, why should we accept it? There's a perfectly more legitimate interpretation that God does not put himself into a body. You see, if you look in the Rambam is careful to show that in addition to the fact that logically it makes no sense, he actually brings many proofs from Scripture as well that God does not have a body. Right? For example, he brings the verse, El mi tidamyuni v'eshveh. To what can you compare me that I should be likened? Now, if God had a body, then there would be some basis of similarity to other things that have bodies. There'd be one universal, one thing they have common, that they all have bodies. In other words, if God says that I am beyond comparison, I am not like anything else, then the verse itself implies he has no body. So the Rambam is not just saying that logically, he has what he believes is a compelling proof, right? And therefore, the other verses which speak about his bodies are metaphoric. But the truth is to say that it's better to believe this way, right? Really means that it's better to subject God to limits and create a paradox that probably is not logically founded.
Why did King Solomon have such difficulty with on this parasha, which he didn't understand?
He wanted to understand how it could be, right? But that's the point. A human being can't understand it. You have to live with it. You're not going to understand it.
So is that the conclusion he came to?
Well, he tried. He tried from every angle, right? It's like homeopathy. Anybody go to a homeopath?
Yes.
They believe you can cure illnesses by ingesting the agent that causes the illness. Doesn't make any sense. But this is what they believe. So people try to think, how does it work? Why does it work? How does it make sense? So Shlomo tried. But the truth is, you reach a point, there's no way for a human being to understand it, but you have to be able to cope with it. Yes?
I heard, I believe, Rabbi Weinberg in his tape saying that Catholicism moved towards the mother for the very same reason, the Mother Mary, so to speak, because that was even more comfortable for them than the son. And so the son kind of took a real side seat to the mother, and now much of their prayer is related to the mother, and for similar reasons.
There are movements within Catholicism. The Catholic Church is not monolithic. The previous pope to this one was very much a devotee of the Virgin Mary. This one is, my understanding, is not quite as much. So I think even within Catholicism, there are, just as within Judaism, it's not that every Orthodox Jew is exactly the same way. There are different hashkafas, different shittas, and different perspectives, and so on and so forth. So the Catholic Church shouldn't be an exception.